Hello there, very good morning to you all. Thank you for joining us and being with us this morning. My name is Robert Dinsmore. I'm the High Availability Product Manager here at Solutions PT. I'm going to be talking about the product relevance today from ACP. This is one of the number of webinars that we've produced as part of our Industrial IT webinar series. Perhaps just a brief bit of background on me before I start. I've been with the company now coming up for 8 years. My background has been in the underwear business for 4 years or so, but it was almost 3 years ago now that I moved across to this part of the business to look at the ThinManager product. Product that we've had a huge amount of success with, lots and lots of customers and deployments in all kinds of different areas. And what we're going to talk about today, the relevance product, is an extension or an addition into that product. So let me start by just trying to set the scene and giving you a little bit of context. I've got some data here that we've had from Gartner, and it's talking about the trend and the change that's happening in terms of device shipments, device purchases. So you can see there, if you look across the last 3 years, we talk about the sales of PCs that are rapidly on the decline. That's probably not a surprise to any of you to hear that. It's been the case for some time, but what's happening at the same time is we're seeing a huge rise in increase in uptake in the use of mobile devices. So we talk about the different categories here, and ultra mobile means a smartphone. That's a sort of US term, I think. There's then obviously tablets and standard mobile phones, and if you look at all of those, you can see there's a huge increase, and it's very clear the way things are going. But for what it's worth, we'll put the trends in there to show you. So you can see that PCs are clearly declining, and we're seeing a huge increase in mobile devices. Indeed, tablets are actually getting to the stage where they're going to outsell PCs already, which shows you how quickly things are changing. The devices that we've all started with, iPads on our laps at home, is actually becoming a trend that's prevalent everywhere. And people are starting to ask questions about whether they can use these devices within their work systems, within their factory systems, and indeed are looking for ways to do that in a safe, secure and measured manner. So there's some very particular things to talk about when we talk about mobile devices. So obviously the advantage of being able to walk around and not be fixed to a particular terminal, but alongside that there's lots of features and things that you can do with a mobile phone that move you along quite a bit from being fixed at a desk. So if we talk about cameras, we talk about positioning systems and so on. And these devices are becoming ubiquitous. Virtually everybody carries at least one. I know a lot of people, myself included, that are forced to carry two. So it's very, very clear that we're in the midst of a huge change in terms of technology. What we found from talking to customers, and certainly a perception, is that that there are specific risks around using these kind of devices in an industrial environment, and indeed many people will have a number of requirements that they need to satisfy before they can even get close to contemplating using these kind of devices in this kind of area. Equally, people maybe don't want to bring their iPads from home and actually bring them in and use them for work processes as well. Certainly if we're talking about factories where the conditions are quite likely to be harsh, then people aren't necessarily going to want to bring their own tablet in and use them. I think we've certainly in the conversations I've had, there are some people that still take the view that there isn't any need for mobile devices. Is that something that we have to go to all the effort of making work? We're here to try and explain to you what we can do to try and get around some of these challenges. And principally, one of the most 100% sensible concerns is around safety and how we provide access in a managed fashion, and do so in a way that gives us some controls so that we can ensure that the access has been granted to the right people and it's been granted in the right areas, and we're not getting ourselves into the nightmare scenario where somebody could accidentally be controlling something that they shouldn't, or something that could pose a safety risk or damage a person or some equipment. Every factory is different, there's no question of that, but certainly in our experience there are some common concerns that factories and industrial type customers will share, and anybody who knows a little bit about the ThinManager product will understand that it is very much a tailored and specifically designed product to cope with the needs that factories have. And Relevance is no different to that. It's absolutely designed to integrate in exactly the same way with the ThinManager product, and it extends in a way that allows you to continue to concern yourself with those kind of problems. So, if we just talk a little bit more about mobile devices, clearly they're very prevalent. Everybody knows what they are and that they're around. But we would say that we're in the middle of a real shift in technology. But I think it's fair to say that while that shift is coming, no one is expecting a complete replacement of everything that's companies have already existed in and already invested in. Sorry. What we see far more likely is that there is a mixed-use environment coming where people are being forced to manage multiple different types of device, whether that's thin clients, whether it's PCs, and indeed mobile devices. And it's the flexibility that offers to the workforce which is making it become such an attractive thing for customers to do. There's quite a lot of potential for innovation, both in devices, but also within process workflows, if we can actually utilize these kind of systems within an industrial type scenario. So, we are not at all suggesting that everybody's going to bin the investments that they've already made in hardware and equipment. As I said, we're far more likely to find ourselves in a mixed-use environment, and indeed we are finding this. We've got a number of customers that have this kind of challenge already. So they've got multiple types of device that they want to send the same kind of applications to. And increasingly, we see these devices being needed to coexist and be managed together. As I've said, the big difference with mobile devices, other than the fact you can carry them around, is the fact that they have some very useful features in them. And those features allow us to understand the location of the device and also allow us to understand who it is that's using the device and to authenticate or to log that person in. Those two things give us the ability to then decide how and when to deliver content to those users. And what we're going to talk about is how the Relevance product enables that to happen, so that we can send the right information to the right user at the right time or place. So some of you may have heard the name Relevance. I say it's the newest release from ACP. The product has been out around 10 months or so now. We're coming up to our first year with it. We've already had some fantastic success, and I look forward to explaining it to you in a lot more detail. So, what is Relevance? What is it designed to do? I think the best way that I can try and bring this to life is to take you through an example. So, I'd like to start by taking consideration of a simple factory. We've got a lemonade factory here. Hopefully this example is close enough to something that you're working on yourself. So we have a factory and we have a number of distinct areas here, cleaning, labelling and so on. And then what we will have is some kind of terminal, like we indicate on the left here. And what you can see is that there's a HMI application or a SCADA application that's running on that. What actually are we going to want to send to the device? And that's one of the first questions that we need to answer when we're looking at how we might set up a relevant system. So on the previous slide we showed HMI or an in-touch type application, but I want to make the point that it could just as easily be other types of application. Those of you who are already using ThinManager will already be aware that it's perfectly possible to use a multitude of different applications. Any software that will run on a terminal server in a Microsoft remote desktop environment is a candidate to be used here. So we've got some examples here, and yes, it could be SCADA, as we've got on the top left, and that point to make is it could well be other SCADAs than InTouch as well. We've had lots of success with Rockwell, with iFix, with Delta V, even with WinCC. So SCADA applications absolutely, but quite likely other things such as something like a PLC programming application like we've got on the left, or indeed on the right, the two different types of documentation that we might have, PDFs, diagrams and so on, are all different types of content that potentially we could be launching and sending to users with this product. So if we just take a step back for a second to think about this content and where does it actually come from? What is the source of it? So typically the content will be running in terminal servers in either your data center or in your computer room somewhere, and you may well have one or you may well have a number depending on the size of the system and the amount of redundancy that you have within it. In addition, again, anybody who's used ThinManager will know that it's very straightforward to integrate IP camera feeds into the system. They are absolutely a type of content that, again, we could use here or that we could send to mobile devices. And in addition, it's possible to shadow all of the other clients that are out on the system. So again, a shadow session is another type of content that we can potentially send to users with this. What we need to talk or think about now is, with this content, who actually owns it? How do we decide what goes where? And this is where we require a slight shift perhaps from maybe the way things have been thought about before. So, you know, historically we may well say that either a client or a fixed area owns the content that's being displayed on it, and I'm sure most plants that will ring true in the sense that they will have a machine or a group of machines that do a specific job. But is it really the case that a fixed device owns the content? You know, if we talk about a cleaning application, then actually it's tied to the cleaning area. That's where it relates to, that's what it's used for. Equally, if we've got some information on a motor, it ties to the motor. This one happens to be in the packing area. Content is usually relevant to either an object or a location. So, if we take that a step further, what we can do with the Relevance product, and what it's designed to do, is to allow you to build an additional model or an additional hierarchy that will sit on top of the existing one that you find within ThinManager. So again, if I can take you through in an example, the first thing that you'll do is sit down and build a location hierarchy. As we've just covered, this whole product is built around the idea that the content that you want to bring to users is tied to physical locations. So we'll start by building a hierarchy of all the different locations. So again, if we take this example back to our factory, we've got a lemonade factory, we've got a number of areas, and within that we can then define the different locations that exist. So you can see them listed below, and then within those sections we can talk about the assets or the equipment that exist within them. So once we've actually started to flesh that out, we would then decide what content needs to be made available in which specific location. Okay, so again, if we just take this example on, we've got a number of different HMI or SCADA packages. They will relate to certain areas. We've then got some schematics and some additional documents. Again, they'll relate to particular assets or locations. We've then got things like control logics or PLC programming applications, which again will be used in certain areas where certain pieces of equipment are. So we can tie the content to specific locations within the relevant system, and this is then the hierarchy that the system will enforce and bring to life for you. So how is this done? I can hear some of you asking, and the way that it's done, this is, I guess, to some extent the clever part of what Relevance does, is it integrates with what we term resolvers or resolving technology, and this is features that allow us to determine the location of the device. So if I talk about the kind of resolvers that there are, this problem some of you might have guessed, we're talking about QR codes, near-field controllers, that's the same kind of technology that's used in contactless payments, Bluetooth beacons, and indeed GPS systems as well. Now there's a few things listed there, and there's a number of different ways we can use those, we can combine them, but they're grouped into what we call active and passive resolvers. So the active resolvers will require someone to actually do something, which in this case would be either scan a QR code with the camera on the tablet, or a near-field controller, which requires you to scan your device within range of a sensor. They're active, they require the user to do something. We then have passive as well, so a Bluetooth beacon is very commonly used, probably the most popular thing that we've been doing thus far, and that's a beacon or a series of beacons that you could mount within the plant that will fire out a Bluetooth signal across a defined space or area. So if you're then within range of that beacon, again the system recognises that, it's a resolver, and it can make decisions based on what it understands. And of course it's possible to queue these up and use them in conjunction, and I will talk about some examples a little bit further on. So the next step, once you've built those elements of the hierarchy, is to then apply the resolvers to the model. So again, if we come back to our example, we can now put some Bluetooth beacons out into the plant. They now tie to specific areas. Again, in addition, we've put some QR codes and some near-field controllers on some of the specific assets, like so. Now what we've got to decide to do is what happens when we have resolved the location of the device. So in other words, we're defining how that content is actually used and delivered to the user. Okay, and to explain that a little bit further, I want to just take a minute to define the actions that are possible. And this is really key to the way that the product's evolving and the uses that are available for it. So, as we said, there's multiple types of application that we could bring to the user. But the other point to mention is that there's a number of ways we could do that. So we have the option to clone, which is to create a new version of whatever the session is that's running. So in other words, we will create an additional session, open that to the device that would be similar to the session we've cloned, but the clone session would still be there, okay? And that's distinctly different from a transfer, where we'll simply grab a session that is sat on one device and we'll take it away from there and put it onto a mobile device. Then the third option is to shadow. So if there is an existing session already running somewhere else and you simply want a view of that, then again it's possible to shadow that session to the mobile device. And I explain those because they are distinct and will probably make a little more sense when I cover some of the examples slightly further on. So just to explain that further, so if we talk about a transfer or a clone or a shadow, then that's three different types of activity that we've got that we can perform. It's worth making a further point in terms of compatibility. The Relevance product is built on version 7 of ThinManager. A number of you may well have attended the webinar that we ran 3 weeks ago, which talked about the release of ThinManager 8, and that is out now. But if you're an existing user, you need to have at least version 7 for you to be able to get ThinManager Relevance to work. As I say, 8 is what's available today, so if you are currently using version 7 and you're on support, you're more than welcome to talk to us about an upgrade for that. But yeah, it will need to be at least version 7 if you want to make use of the product that we're outlining today. Okay, so I just want to take what I've put forward a little further into some use cases that will hopefully bring some of this topic to life and give you a little bit more clarity. I've got 5 different scenarios that I want to cover, and these give you a feel for some of the capabilities of Relevance. I think it's fair to say this is a product that is continually evolving, so we will absolutely expect to see additional types of resolvers and technologies and functionalities added in. But already we've got some fantastic things that we can talk about. So I'll give you some of these examples today, and hopefully that will give you a clearer picture of what can be done. Okay, so if we take the first scenario, we've got a situation where an operator is working out on the filling line and there's a need to actually calibrate some of the physical equipment. But the valves themselves are located away from where the SCADA terminal is, the fixed terminal. So for this to happen, for him to be able to safely do that, what he really needs is a colleague. It requires an additional person to monitor the SCADA and take the necessary steps or ensure that things are safe and safely controlled, while he actually puts his hands into the machine or decides to do some calibration work or some changes. So in a situation like this, the ability to be able to make a transfer would potentially help the user out a great deal, because he can take the application and he can transfer it from the fixed terminal to the tablet, which means that he's still got a view of the application while he's observing the calibration. He's not forced to use another person, and he can work in a more flexible way. Hopefully that's relatively straightforward, but you can see how that's quite an advantage if in the past it's either required 2 people or it's there's been a safety reason why it's not something that somebody could do on their own safely. In the second scenario, if we say that we've got somebody, a user type who's a supervisor, they want to have a view of any of the SCADA applications while they're out walking the plant floor. But when he's walking the plant floor, he only really needs to see the SCADA application that relates to the equipment or the area where he actually is. So, he only needs to see the relevant SCADA for the system that he's sat in front of. But what he can't do is interrupt with what the operators are already doing, because we can't afford to take the session away from the operators. This is an additional view that the supervisor would have. So in a situation like this, we can use the clone. So he will simply take a copy of the SCADA, an additional session, and just to clarify, it's a clone of a session, so it would consume an additional ThinManager license, and it would also consume an additional Microsoft CAL. But if that is simply a clone or a shadow of an existing session, then it wouldn't consume an independent SCADA license. It depends on whether that application is being used by one person or not, and I'll explain that further if there's any questions. In a situation like this, the supervisor is able to take a clone, so as he walks around the area, he can see all the applications, he can see everything that's happening without interfering with what the operators are doing. Okay, so in the third scenario, we've got two different types of user that have different requirements in terms of either the applications or the information that we need. So if we take the example of an operator and they're concerned with the status of the motor, they need to understand that in case there's any repairs or work to be done. Maintenance, on the other hand, have a different requirement. They need to see some of the historical information, they need to see the operating documents that relate to the equipment. So because we're using relevance, we have the capability to send different types of application to different classes of users. That's something that we can easily define within ThinManager. So in a case like this, we could put a QR code onto the motor to the relevant area, and then as each of the different user types comes up to the device and scans them, because they're already logged into the tablet as their particular user type, the system knows who they are and is able to deliver the dynamically deliver the relevant content that they need. So our operator gets his application and the maintenance guy gets the necessary documentation and information that he requires. Okay, so further example, if we had, let's say, a conveyor motor which we wanted to start, it needs to be started locally while it's being observed, because doing so remotely is not safe and there's a risk of somebody being injured, then what we can do is we can put, similar to the last example, we can put a QR code onto the motor, which means that the only way the operator can get access to that is if he's physically in that zone. So we can authenticate that he is by forcing him to complete a QR code scan with that QR code in place of that physical device. So as such, it won't work when he's in the wrong area, but when he gets to where the specific asset is, that QR code ties up, satisfies the system that he is physically in place, and therefore the access to the required application is granted. And in this scenario, we've got a situation where an operator needs to have access to a particular type of SCADA whenever he's near that equipment, but we don't want him to have access to it when he's not near the equipment. So in other words, it's location specific, and if he goes to a different area, we don't want him to be able to then see or control that part of the system. So to achieve something like that, we can actually use the Bluetooth beacon as a passive locator, which allows that guy to move across the plant, across the different areas, and when he's within the range of the different beacons, automatically the session is loaded and launched. Now, any of you who have been to some of our events over the last 6 months or so will have probably seen me demonstrating that, where we walk across the room and you can see how applications dynamically move from one to another simply based on the Bluetooth, which is something that works incredibly well. The very first project that we did, which was some 10 months or so ago now, works quite like this example here. So just to briefly explain, the customer has operations that takes place on 3 floors. They have a sort of large stacked production organisation that's built up on 3 floors. So each floor manufactures a different part of the process and runs a different in-touch application. So in this example, the operators are able to move between level 1, level 2 and level 3, and as they do so, their tablets, iPads in this case, are automatically updated with the relevant SCADA for the relevant area. So there's no need to change, connect or anything like that. The system will just automatically launch to the user the right session that they need as they move through the location. Like you can see in the example there. Okay, now one of the other things that we've been asked about is it always just going to be iPads? And those of you who've been using ThinManager for a while will know that integrated Apple functionality has been within the product for 2 or 3 versions now. It's certainly been a few years. But what's happened is there's been a growing clamour for the release of Android compatibility as well. And again, going back to the last webinar, anybody who was on that will know that with ThinManager 8 that was released just 2 months ago, we now have the ability to make use of Android devices as well. And that's particularly interesting from our perspective, because what it means is we're able to get access to quite a much larger and wider range of tablet devices. Anybody who's familiar with Android will know there's a huge amount of choice out there. What's particularly interesting for us is that the brand Ecom, a company you may or may not have heard of before, they've certainly been in the business for a long time, but what they've done is they've produced a very good range of tablets that can be used within hazardous areas, and those devices are Android capable, so they're absolutely candidates to be used here with ThinManager and with Relevance. We've already done numerous tests and so on to satisfy ourselves that all these things work, and we've been very, very pleased with what we've seen. So we've actually decided to partner with Ecom. Anyone who subscribes to our emailers and our alerts will see some stuff coming through from us in the next few weeks, because Ecom is about to become a partner, and we're very excited about that, because actually we see a particularly good deployment of this technology that we've discussed today into hazardous areas. So the world's first Zone 1 tablet, it will be available from Ecom fairly shortly. I think the current release is scheduled for sort of September, October time. We will certainly be telling you as soon as we know exactly when that will be. And there are other sort of Zone 2 devices that I think have been around for a little while, but to our knowledge this is the first one that is Zone 1, and one of the attractions of that, of course, is that the Zone 1 device can be used in the other areas, but you probably wouldn't want to do it the other way around. So from a safety perspective, you've got the ability to now give someone a device they can take anywhere within the plant. We can use Relevance to make sure that they always get the right applications launched as they move between those areas, but more importantly, we've removed any safety concerns about somebody crossing into an area where they shouldn't be using a device that isn't Zone 1 safe. We see a lot of exciting applications for this. The obvious one being that we know some customers spend quite a lot of expense to purchase devices. Most of you have probably seen them, the larger, heavy-set, thin client devices, the likes from Pepper and Fuchs and so on, the style devices, anywhere from the region of maybe £10,000 to £12,000 for a Zone 1 thin client. So potentially these devices are, I think, somewhere in the region of sort of 3 to 3.5K. So not only are they significantly less expensive to acquire, but actually offer potentially a huge amount more flexibility as well. So we're really excited about this. We anticipate a lot of interest, and we're certainly here and available if anybody wants to ask questions on that as well. I know that one of my colleagues will be running a WebEx on this topic very shortly. I think I'll talk about the schedule for that in a moment. But in terms of just recapping what we've covered, we started off by talking about mobile devices and how they're everywhere, and that's something not a trend that Solutions PT or ACP has started. That's just happening. It's everywhere. They are prevalent right across life now. We've come a long way in a short time in terms of mobile devices, but certainly now they are definitely starting to become prevalent in the automation world. There are a number of areas within manufacturing we see that the ability to use mobile devices is particularly well suited, and hopefully some of those examples that we've given you give you a starting point in starting to understand how you might apply that to your own systems. The inclusion of the cheap, versatile, flexible positioning systems in mobile phones or mobile tablets opens up a whole load of new possibilities. What does that mean? Well, it means that we can push information where it's needed, when it's needed, and to the right person who needs it. So that's exactly what relevance is. That's exactly what it does. I hope that's brought the topic to life a little bit more. As I said, there will be more information available. You can certainly take a look on our website and you will find some additional data sheets and so on. I think they'll be very shortly be populated with the latest ones for ThinManager 8 as well. There'll be a recording of this webinar available a few days afterwards for anyone who joined late. We'll be able to take questions in a moment, but I anticipate there may be questions around pricing, but equally, you can come to us, speak to your Solutions PC account manager, and we can discuss that, or indeed you can email into us. As I said, we will be covering the next webinar to talk about the Ecom tablets in more detail, so we'll actually have one of our friends from Ecom actually joining us for that on the day, and we'll be going through those devices in more detail and give a lot more insight into the features, functionality, price, release, and so on. So that's scheduled for the 24th of September. Okay, so that concludes what I wanted to outline today as a starting point. I am more than happy to take questions if there are any this morning. I do think we've got a number of people logged in on the chat window, and we may also have some people logged in on the line as well. So I can unmute the line. I'll be more than happy to take them. Okay, so I can't hear anybody calling in, so hopefully there's nobody trying to and struggling. If there is any confusion, by all means ask in the chat box. I will just address the question on price, because I know lots of people have asked about that. What ACP have decided to do is provide a couple of different options. So, as is often the case with licensing, it does require you to come to us and speak, really. But essentially, if you've got a larger system, there's a fixed price license that you can buy, and that will give you unlimited relevance use. If you've got a much smaller system, then you can add relevance functionality on a per head basis. And we can talk to you about the size of the system that you've got and the best way to structure that. And then that per head basis cost is actually added into the annual support contract. It is a requirement of the relevance product that you have your support contract up to date. So it kind of enforces that. But you may be surprised by the cost, and we'll be more than happy to give individual details relevant to a system that you have, depending on your requirements. We get asked about licensing and how that's actually set up and deployed, and I should maybe just take a moment to clarify what I said earlier about licensing. So anybody who's familiar with the ThinManager product will know that it's licensed by the number of clients that you decide to connect. So, historically, if someone put in a 10 Thin client system, they'd have 10 physical Thin clients, and each one of those would consume a ThinManager session license. In terms of mobility and relevance, that really works in exactly the same way. You would just simply add the tablets or the phones as an additional count to the client. So in this case, we've said we've got 10 clients. If you then decided to add 3 tablets and 2 phones, you would need 15 users worth of ThinManager. So every mobile device will consume a ThinManager license count in exactly the same way. On top of that, it will consume the terminal services, a Microsoft CAL, and then you will need application licensing for whatever session it is that you're running. And as I said earlier, and I'll just clarify, if you want to run an independent session, then it will consume an extra InTouch or FactoryTalk or WinCC license, whatever you're using. If it is a shadow of an existing session, then it will not consume a SCADA application license. It will simply take a copy of the other session and make that visible on another screen. So you would have 2 users trying to use the same session. So it's not giving you a way around concurrency. What it is doing is it's allowing somebody else to see the system from somewhere else, which is not in any way against licensing law. It's exactly what products like PC Anywhere have been doing for years, and this just makes it work in a very simple way and allows that to be sent to a tablet. So I hope that's clarified some of those questions a little bit. I'm more than happy to take more, and I anticipate we'll probably get quite a few on the email, so I'll be more than happy to answer those. I'd like to thank you for your time.